When Kristalina Georgieva made a jab at Ibrahim Traore's educational background, most of the room laughed politely, but one student didn't, and what she said next would silence the entire auditorium. It was a Thursday afternoon in Paris, at the prestigious Université de la Sorbonne. The hall was packed, a couple hundred attendees, students, academics, journalists, NGO workers, and a handful of people who'd heard that something unusually political and raw was about to unfold on campus. The panel was titled Global Leadership, Development, and the Power of Narrative. On the glossy flyer, 4 headshots were displayed, but one drew attention more than the rest. Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF, a name that sparked admiration in some, deep mistrust in others. Inside, the air was electric, not hostile yet, but heavy with expectation. People weren't just there to listen. They were there to judge, to question, to witness. Some came for the spectacle, some for participation credit, and some, like the quiet young woman in the last row, came for reasons even they hadn't fully sorted out. The moderator, Professor Elena Wexler, seasoned and impeccably composed, introduced the panelists. She had moderated enough world-shaping conversations to be unshaken by tension, but even she could sense this one might test her limits. To Georgieva's right sat Dr. Cecil Owens, a black political science professor from Georgetown, known for his unapologetic critiques of global economic institutions. To her left, Laya Xu, a sharp journalist from San Francisco whose investigative features on international development had landed her on panels across 3 continents. And finally, at the far end of the stage, a surprise last-minute addition. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, interim president of Burkina Faso. His inclusion had caused a quiet stir. Some attendees leaned in when his name was announced. Others folded their arms. You could see alliances by the rhythm of applause. And you could spot who was filming for social media by the way their phones hovered at chest level, screens tilted down, thumbs twitching. The discussion moved from how the media shapes development narratives to how world leaders are perceived based on where they studied, how they speak, and whether their credentials fit into the Western mold. This was Traore's battleground. Subtly, calmly, he pushed back on assumptions. His voice carried the calm defiance of someone who had stood not in lecture halls, but in military barracks, in village forums. He spoke without embellishment, just clarity. Georgieva, on the other hand, occupied her space with seasoned presence. She smiled tightly when interrupting, not loudly, but with precision. Her words often sounded as though they had been workshopped by a dozen consultants. And then it came, the moment that cracked the room open. She leaned back as if shifting into control. While discussing the international perception of leadership, Georgieva said with a peaceful smile, "Let's not pretend every head of state was shaped by Oxford or Harvard. Some came into power through, let's just say, less rigorous paths." A few chuckles. One man in the back laughed too loud. And then, silence. Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. But the room did. The moderator subtly cleared her throat and tried to steer the conversation forward. Dr. Owens narrowed his eyes. Laya Xu looked down at her notepad. But in the last row, a young woman gripped her chair's armrest a little tighter. She hadn't planned to speak. She barely made it there at all. Her roommate had to convince her. But in that moment, something inside her split open. Because when Kristalina said less rigorous paths, it didn't feel like she was talking about Ibrahim Traoré anymore. It felt like she was talking about her. And no one in that auditorium, not even Kristalina Georgieva, had any idea what was about to unfold. It didn't rattle her. Kristalina Georgieva had weathered protests, press blowback, and entire nations' discontent. In fact, she thrived on pressure. She glanced around the room as if daring anyone to challenge what she just said. A few chuckles rolled through the audience again, but this time they felt thinner, more unsure, the kind of laugh you give when you're not sure if you're supposed to. Captain Ibrahim Traoré remained composed, upright, calm, hands folded in his lap, his eyes locked gently but firmly on Kristalina. He was no stranger to this kind of subtle dismissal. He had been doubted, ignored, even erased, until he couldn't be. The silence after Georgieva's comments stretched like a wire pulled taut. Everyone waited to see what he would do. Finally, Traoré spoke. His voice was level, clear, and grounded. "I didn't study at Oxford," he said, "but I trained as a soldier, a scientist, and a servant of my people. And I've yet to find a treaty or a village without water that needed a Western degree to solve its crisis." A few claps, tentative at first, broke the tension, more a release than celebration. He wasn't angry. He hadn't taken the bait, but he'd said enough. Still, the moment wouldn't dissolve as easily as some had hoped. You could feel the shift in the room. Heads turned, whispers began. A few students exchanged glances. The current had changed, subtly but undeniably. And in that current, in the very back row, the student who had clenched the armrest, her name was Alina Garvey, couldn't stop replaying what had just been said. Not just Traore's words, but Kristalina's. Because Georgieva's remark hadn't sounded like a geopolitical comment. It had sounded personal, as if people like Alina, who didn't come from legacy or privilege, didn't count. As if struggle was a sign of inferiority, not resilience. Alina had grown up in Lok, a worn-down suburb of Ouagadougou. Her mother cleaned offices at night. Her father fixed cars with cracked, frozen hands during the dry season. She'd clawed her way into university. 3 jobs, scholarships, long bus rides, 1 meal a day some weeks. She didn't see herself in Ibrahim Traoré every day, but in that moment, she did. And what stuck with her most, it wasn't what Georgieva said. It was how easily she said it. As if effort without the right seal didn't count. As if merit, unpolished, could be dismissed with a smirk. Professor Wexler tried to steer the discussion back. Let's move to our next question. How media framing affects perceptions of policy legitimacy. But no one was really listening anymore. Dr. Owens leaned forward, his voice slow and sharp. It always fascinates me, he said, how quickly lived experience is discounted if it comes from the wrong neighborhood or the wrong school. Some of the smartest minds I've ever met never set foot on an Ivy League campus. Kristalina offered a controlled smile, but her eyes narrowed. She didn't enjoy being contradicted, especially not by someone the room respected. Laya Shu said nothing, but you could see her writing, fast, focused, maybe for a future article, maybe to process. And then from the back, a voice, soft but firm. Excuse me. Heads turned. Kristalina's brows lifted. Alina stood, notebook in hand, thumb tucked inside the pages like a lifeline. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the pressure of knowing everyone was watching now, and knowing she hadn't rehearsed this. I just wanted to say, she glanced down, then up again, steadier now. For some of us, getting into university was the hardest part. We didn't have private tutors. We didn't grow up with parents who went to college. So when someone questions the legitimacy of where we studied, she paused. The auditorium held its breath. They're not just talking about credentials. They're talking about people, about families like mine. They're talking about families like mine. Alina's voice cracked slightly, and the entire auditorium froze. She wasn't attacking. She wasn't shouting. She was simply telling the truth. And truth, when spoken plainly and from the soul, has a way of halting even the most composed, confident person in their tracks. But this wasn't the end. It was just the spark. Because from the moment Alina spoke, something began to ripple through that hall, something irreversible. Alina hadn't planned to speak. She wasn't the type to raise her hand in large rooms. She took notes, she watched, she kept her head down and turned her work in on time. But when she sat in that auditorium and heard Kristalina Georgieva dismiss someone's educational background with a smirk, it hit like a punch she couldn't dodge. Not just because it was dismissive, because it was familiar. She'd heard it before, maybe in a guidance counselor's condescending tone or in the subtle looks from classmates when she mentioned she had gone to a public school. She hadn't prepared a speech. Her throat was dry, but she knew too well the feeling of shrinking in rooms designed to make you feel small. And now here she was, standing, her voice, the only one filling the silence with tone. You said something earlier about certain degrees not being as rigorous, she continued, her tone steadier than expected. But I don't think you understand what it takes for some of us to even make it to a classroom. She didn't flinch, not when every eye turned her way. The moderator didn't interrupt. Even Kristalina was silent. Alina looked down at her notebook. Then calmly, she closed it. She didn't need it anymore. My mom didn't finish high school. She works night shifts. My dad doesn't speak much French or English, but he still makes sure I have food before I go to class. I didn't grow up with test prep books or elite tutors. I studied in laundromats and on the backseat of a city bus. I fought to be here. A few quiet gasps, a soft from somewhere in the front rows. No applause, just a silence that was heavy, real. Dr. Owens leaned back slightly, arms folded, watching her closely. Ibrahim Traoré didn't move, but his eyes softened. There was something in Alina that echoed something in himself. And now she was looking directly at Kristalina Georgieva. Her voice no longer shook. When you make a joke about someone's school, you're not just talking about where they went. You're talking about how they got there. And for people like me, that journey isn't a line on a resume. It's survival. Kristalina blinked once, then again. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The room no longer felt sharp. It felt heavy. honest. Professor Wexler looked as though she might speak, but she didn't. She let the moment breathe. Finally, Captain Traoré broke the silence. Soft, measured, but firm. "What's your name?" Alina hesitated. "Alina Garvey." Traoré gave her a small, sincere nod. "Thank you, Alina." Just 3 words. But the way he said them felt like so much more. It was validation, recognition, respect. Somewhere in the middle of the room, someone whispered, "Wow." A student in a university hoodie leaned forward, elbows on knees. She really just said that. No one laughed this time. Kristalina shifted in her seat, clearing her throat. "I wasn't trying to insult anyone's experience," she said, her tone clipped and defensive. "I was making a point about public perception But Traoré interrupted, not loud, just clear. "Perceptions shaped by people in power, Madame Georgieva. And when those in power use that influence to mock someone's origins, they don't get to hide behind semantics." That was it. Alina sat down slowly, her heart still pounding, unsure whether what she had just done was brave or reckless. Her hands trembled slightly as she reopened her notebook, but the pen stayed still. For once, she wasn't there to take notes. The panel didn't return to normal. The rhythm was gone. Something had cracked. The moderator, Professor Wexler, thanked the panelists for a lively exchange of ideas, but her voice lacked its usual composure. Dr. Owens added a few thoughtful remarks, and Laya Shu read a short quote from a recent article on educational equity. But no one was really listening. Everyone was still thinking about Alina, because once you hear something that honest, you can't unhear it. What Alina didn't realize was that her words hadn't just touched a nerve, they'd flung open a door, and others in the room were about to walk through it. The physical room hadn't changed. People hadn't moved much, but you could feel it. Bodies slightly tenser, eyes either locked on the panel or flickering back toward the girl in the last row. Kristalina Georgieva, never one to lose control of a narrative, kept her expression composed, but her eyes flickered, not with confusion, but calculation. She wasn't used to being checked in public, especially not by a student, and especially not like this. No yelling, no theatrics, no hashtags, just truth handed to her like a mirror. She leaned toward the mic. "Let me clarify something," she began, voice even but clipped. "My comment wasn't directed at anyone personally. I was making a general point about how global leaders are perceived in relation to their academic backgrounds." Alina, back in her seat now, stared ahead. She wasn't going to speak again, unless she had to. But Ibrahim Traoré moved in his chair, slowly, deliberately. Then he turned toward Kristalina. "With all due respect," he said calmly, "you made it personal when you looked directly at me." Kristalina's brows lifted. "I never said your name." "You didn't need to," Traoré replied, his voice razor-sharp but steady. His eyes didn't flinch. The implication was clear to everyone in this room. The moderator jumped in, voice taut. "Let's try to keep the conversation productive." But Traoré wasn't finished. He didn't raise his voice. If anything, it dropped, lower, firmer, which made it land harder. "There's a difference," he said, "between critiquing systems and reinforcing them. You can speak about media bias without devaluing someone's journey. You can challenge public perception without feeding the very stereotypes that keep people out of the room." Kristalina tried to deflect. "We're all adults here. Let's not pretend we haven't all taken shots." Traoré's tone sharpened, just slightly. "Taking shots is politics," he said, "but labeling someone's education as less rigorous, that's a dog whistle. And it's one too many of us have heard before." The audience stirred. A few heads nodded. One woman in the front row muttered under her breath, "He's right." Kristalina looked to Professor Wexler, waiting for rescue. But Wexler didn't move. She stayed silent, pen in hand, lips pressed together. And then, from the second row, a hand went up. Unexpected, hesitant. Wexler blinked, surprised but nodded. "Go ahead." A student stood, Latina, early 20s, university sweatshirt, eyes wide but steady. "Sorry, I know this isn't a Q&A, but I just wanted to say, when I heard what you said, Ms. Georgieva," she paused, then inhaled. "I thought about all the times I've had to explain to my uncle why going to community college first wasn't a shortcut. I worked nights, saved every penny, transferred here because I earned it." She looked at Kristalina. "So when someone implies that my education isn't elite enough, it doesn't sound like a joke. It sounds like you're saying I don't belong." Silence again. And then another student stood, this time a white guy in jeans and dusty boots. He looked around awkwardly. "I didn't grow up poor," he said plainly. "I had help," the young man in boots admitted. "But my roommate, he's from the Valley, first in his family to even finish high school." He paused, his voice steady but charged. "What y'all are talking about, it's not just politics. It's real. It's about who gets respected, Now the shift in the room was undeniable. It wasn't a panel anymore. It was a reckoning. Kristalina Georgieva leaned back, arms crossed, lips pursed. Her control over the narrative, the room was gone. And Alina? She sat silently again, watching. She hadn't meant to lead anything. She hadn't tried to start a movement. But the words had come, and something much bigger had followed them. Captain Ibrahim Traoré scanned the students who had stood up, his voice calm, reflective. This is what real dialogue looks like. Honest, uncomfortable, necessary. Even Dr. Owens looked moved. He tapped his microphone gently. Sometimes, he said, the most important lesson you'll learn on a campus doesn't come from a textbook. It comes from the moment you decide your voice matters. But the moment wasn't done, because what had happened wasn't something you just hear. It had to be processed, absorbed, felt, and one final voice in the room was about to do exactly that. The auditorium no longer felt like a venue for discussion. It had become something else, a place of awakening. You could see it in people's posture. No more slouching, no more half glances at phones. Everyone was tuned in, like even the air itself was holding its breath. Kristalina Georgieva adjusted her mic, but didn't speak. Her mouth tightened as she looked down at her notes, as if trying to find her footing again. But whatever message she had prepared, it no longer fit. Because now the room didn't belong to the panelists. It belonged to the students. And then another figure stood, this time from the third row. He looked older than most, maybe a graduate student or a teaching assistant. He cleared his throat. My name's Jordan Ellis. I teach a freshman seminar on political identity. He looked around the room. And I just want to say, when we let conversations like this turn into resume competitions, we miss the point. Education isn't just about where you studied. It's about what you do with what you learned. And frankly, some of the folks who look down on others' degrees wouldn't last a semester outside their comfort zone. This time, the claps that followed were real, not polite, earned. Kristalina looked toward Professor Wexler, hoping perhaps for an exit. Wexler finally leaned into her mic. Let's pause here, she said gently. There's clearly a strong response in the room, and I think we owe it to the students to let this breathe. Alina was still seated in the back. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her notebook lay open on her lap. Alaika. But she wasn't writing. She was just watching, taking it all in. And then Ibrahim Traoré turned in his chair, not to the audience this time, but to Alina. You started something today, he said. You reminded everyone what courage really looks like. Alina didn't know what to say. She gave a small nod, overwhelmed by the attention, unsure where to place her hands or eyes. But Traoré wasn't finished. I came here expecting debate, he continued. What I found instead was a reminder that our voices don't just echo in rooms like this. They shape them. And sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one holding the mic. It's the one who stands up when it's hardest to. Silence followed, but not the tense kind, the sacred kind, the kind that comes after something honest has settled across a room. And then at last, Kristalina Georgieva spoke again, her tone controlled, but the edge was gone. I've been in public life for a long time, she began. I've faced criticism. I've challenged narratives I believed were unfair. She hesitated. But I'll admit, I didn't expect this. Her voice lowered slightly. And maybe I needed to hear it. That surprised at everyone. It wasn't an apology, but it was a crack in the armor. It wasn't an apology, not quite, but it was a crack in the armor. A rare moment of reflection from someone who seldom gave anyone that satisfaction. Dr. Owens picked up the thread. This isn't about pointing fingers, he said. It's about learning how we talk about each other and who gets to be heard. That matters more than most realize. He scanned the room. Because if the people shaping the future of this country don't feel they belong at the table, then we're in trouble. There was a long pause. Then slowly a round of applause. No one started it. It just happened. No signs, no cues, just clapping from one side of the auditorium to the other. And for the first time since the event began, Kristalina Georgieva didn't interrupt. She just listened. Outside those walls, no one knew what had just taken place. And what was coming next would ensure this story wouldn't stay confined to a lecture hall. When the applause faded, the weight of the moment didn't lift. It lingered, not as tension, but as truth. A girl in the second row leaned to her friend and whispered, I've never seen anything like this. Her friend nodded slowly, eyes fixed ahead, lips pressed tight, afraid that if she spoke, she might cry. Professor Wexler closed her folder gently and placed it on the table. She wasn't going to force the conversation back to the script. This was more important now. And somewhere in that silence, it began to hit people. This moment wasn't really about Kristalina Georgieva or Ibrahim Traoré. Not entirely. It was about something else, something older, something heavier. It was about how people get measured by where they come from, how they speak, what their resume looks like, how close their names sit to power, and how quickly some in that room recognized themselves in Alina's voice, even if they hadn't known her name before today. In the front row, a freshman named Colleen tugged at her hoodie sleeves and stood, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm from Roswell." She looked at no one and everyone at once. "I never thought I'd be smart enough to go to a big school. People always talked over me. I failed my first exam here. I cried in a bathroom stall and almost dropped out." She paused and took a deep breath, but I didn't. And when that comment was made earlier about less rigorous paths, I felt like I was back in that bathroom stall. Like I was already behind before I opened my mouth. Another student stood up behind her, then another. No one asked them to. A Nigerian-American engineering major named Timmy Topi shared how his accent was mocked during a group project. A girl from Amarillo talked about having to drive 90 miles just to get to a testing center for her SAT because her school couldn't afford to host one. None of these stories were about politics. They were about identity, belonging, dignity, and all had been buried under layers of silence until now. Kristalina Georgieva stayed seated. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't speaking, just sitting, eyes scanning the room. For once, she didn't have the loudest presence in the space. Ibrahim Traoré turned toward Professor Wexler, then back to the students. "This is why I ran for office," he said quietly. "Not because I thought I had all the answers, but because too many people who look like me have been asked to prove they belong in rooms they already earned their way into." It wasn't a campaign pitch. There were no slogans, just lived experience, laid bare. Alina still hadn't spoken again, but now people were looking at her with something deeper than admiration, recognition. A girl with curly hair and chipped nail polish slid into the empty seat beside her and whispered, "You said what I've always wanted to say." Alina gave a tiny smile, the kind that doesn't come from pride, but from knowing you didn't stay silent when it mattered most. Back on stage, Dr. Owen spoke again, softer now. "We all want to believe merit is enough," he said, "but merit isn't handed out evenly. Some of us walk into rooms with open doors. Others spend years just trying to find a door that isn't locked." The crowd wasn't cheering anymore. They weren't clapping. They were just listening, soaking it in, processing. And that was the most powerful part. Because this wasn't a viral moment, not yet. No one outside that auditorium was tweeting it, no headlines, no hashtags, but for everyone inside, it was unforgettable. Something still had to be said before the day could settle, not by a panelist, not by a student, but by someone who had quietly been watching it all from the wings. There was a man leaning against the side wall of the auditorium near the exit, mostly unnoticed until now. Tall, dark blazer, university badge on his belt. He hadn't spoken or moved much during the panel, but his eyes had tracked everything. Professor Eli Traynor, Dean of Political Science, former journalist, not flashy, not loud, the kind of man whose silence carries weight when he finally breaks it. He stepped forward as the moment teetered between catharsis and confusion. No mic, no script. "Mind if I say something?" Everyone turned. Even Kristalina looked up, surprised. Traoré nodded once and the man walked closer to the stage. "I wasn't on the panel. Wasn't planning to speak, just came to listen. But it seems something real happened here today, and I think we should acknowledge that before we pretend to go back to business." He scanned the crowd, calm and clear. Students, faculty, guests. We all came expecting a conversation about politics and media. What we got was something harder, something better. We got truth, raw, uncomfortable, beautiful truth. He turned toward Alina. "Miss Garvey, you didn't just speak up. You reminded all of us, especially those of us who've spent too long in meetings and conference calls, why we're even here. Education isn't about pedigree. It's about people like you, and courage like yours. That's the foundation of change." Alina blinked, overwhelmed. She didn't know what to say. A few students around her clapped quietly. Others wiped at their eyes. Then Dean Traynor looked out at the crowd again. "I've spent years in media, in politics. And the most powerful voices I've ever heard didn't come from campaign stages or studio lights. They came from back rows just like this, from people who weren't supposed to say anything, from the ones everyone overlooked." He paused. "So maybe today, instead of pretending this didn't happen, we carry it forward, into the next class, the next conversation, into the way we treat people, especially those who didn't grow up with the world holding the door open for them." The crowd sat still, every ear tuned. Because this wasn't just about one comment or one clap back. This was about who gets to speak, who gets to be heard, Who gets to feel human in spaces built to make them feel small? That hit harder than anyone expected. Even the AV tech at the side stopped fiddling with cables and looked up. Dean Traynor nodded once, then stepped back, hands behind his back. Silence stretched. Not a bad silence, the kind that follows something sacred. Kristalina Georgieva sat with her hands clasped, unmoving. There was no comeback, no soundbite that could reshape what had happened. And that's when Laya Shu, quiet the whole time, her notepad full, finally raised her voice. "I'll be writing about today," she said, "but not as a journalist trying to spin a headline. I'll be writing it down because stories like this don't happen in lecture halls every day, and they deserve to be remembered the right way." She turned toward Alina. "You reminded us that courage doesn't need a podium. Sometimes it only needs a reason." Traoré nodded slowly. "And today gave us one." Students around the room started speaking again, this time in clusters, not to the panel, but to each other. They weren't debating. They were connecting, exchanging names, stories, plans to meet for coffee, and finish conversations that had just begun. No one reached for their phones. No one rushed out. It wasn't about going viral. This was something deeper than that. As the panel drew to a close and students began to gather their things, one final quiet moment gave the day its last note and tied everything back to why it mattered in the first place. The auditorium emptied slowly like people walking through water. No rush, just small movements. Grabbing backpacks, folding jackets over arms, whispering to friends like they were leaving a funeral, not a campus panel. Alina remained seated. She wasn't waiting for applause. There wasn't any. Not the kind you hear in movie endings. This was quieter, heavier, like people knew they'd witnessed something important, and they weren't sure how to carry it. Traoré approached her first. No cameras, no dramatic gestures. Just walked over, heels clicking gently on the floor. "Hey," he said. Alina looked up, unsure if she should stand. She started to, but Traoré waved her off and knelt slightly instead, meeting her at eye level. "I meant what I said earlier." Traoré told her, "You reminded me why I ran in the first place. You didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for hundreds of kids who've been told their stories aren't enough." Alina nodded, eyes wet. "I wasn't trying to be brave. I just couldn't stay quiet." "Brave isn't about wanting to speak," Traoré said softly. "It's about choosing to when it costs you something." They shook hands. It wasn't performative, just mutual respect. As Traoré stood and walked toward the side exit, he passed Kristalina Georgieva. The two exchanged a glance. Neutral. Neither nodded. No handshake, just a brief acknowledgement that the power in the room had shifted, and both of them knew it. Dean Traynor, still standing at the side, caught Alina's eye and gave a small nod, the kind that said, "Well done," without words. Outside, the late afternoon light was fading. A few students hung back in small groups near the courtyard, still talking, still buzzing from what they'd just seen. Some exchanged Instagram handles. Others said nothing at all, just stood together in silence. Alina stepped out with her notebook tucked against her chest like armor. A classmate caught up with Alina on the sidewalk. "Hey, sorry, Melvin," he said nervously. "I just wanted to say what you did in there. That took guts." Alina smiled faintly. "Thanks, I froze up," she admitted. "Wanted to say something too, but I just couldn't." "It's okay," Alina replied. "You don't have to speak every time. Sometimes it's enough just to feel it." They walked side by side for a short distance, no more than 20 feet. Then he turned toward the library while she headed back to the dorms. On her way, Alina passed the same hallway where her first-year orientation had been held. She remembered sitting in the back row then, head down, too nervous to even say her name during introductions. But today she had stood, spoken, shifted a room, and somehow that shifted something inside her too. At her dorm door, she paused with her hand on the key card. A text buzzed on her phone, her roommate asking, "Are you okay? You're all over the campus group chat, Aaron." She didn't answer right away. Inside, a pile of books waited. Homework, a midterm coming up, life unchanged on the surface. But nothing about tonight felt normal. She sat at her desk, opened her notebook, flipped past pages filled with quotes, timelines, deadlines. Then she started a new page. At the top, she wrote, "Use your voice even if it shakes." Below it, "Because someone in the room needs to hear you do it first." Before this story faded into another ordinary school day, one last truth needed telling. Courage doesn't just shift a moment. It reshapes what people believe is possible. The morning after the panel, the campus looked the same, but not to everyone who'd been in that room. Sidewalks buzzed with conversations that had nothing to do with classes. People were still talking about her, the girl from the back row who stood up and said what half the room didn't know they needed to hear. No trending hashtags, No breaking news headlines, just texts, murmurs, and whispered conversations between friends in hallways, library corners, and lunch tables. A screenshot of Ibrahim Traore's words circulated quietly in group chats. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one with the microphone. It's the one who stands up when it's hardest. It hit people differently, not like a quote to repost, but like a question. What would I have done in that room? Professor Wexler sent out an email thanking everyone who attended. At the bottom, she added a line that wasn't part of the university's template. Some lessons live outside the syllabus. Yesterday was one of them. And tucked at the very end, to the student who spoke from the back, thank you. Alina read the email sitting on the steps of the philosophy building. She wasn't sure how to respond, or even if she should. Her phone buzzed with new messages from professors, classmates, even a former TA she hadn't spoken to since freshman year. Most said the same thing in different ways. You made us think. She didn't want to become a symbol. That wasn't the goal. She didn't feel brave. She felt exposed, like she'd said something too loud in a too quiet room and now couldn't take it back. But as the hours passed, it settled differently in her chest. Not like a burden, but like a kind of gravity, a reminder that words matter when they come from where they actually hurt. Later that week, she stopped by Dr. Owens' office. She hadn't planned to, just walked past and saw his door open. He looked up from his laptop. "Ah, Miss Garvey," he said, standing in the doorway. "No thanks needed," he added, gesturing to a chair. "You reminded the rest of us what classrooms are supposed to be about." She sat down. "I didn't think anyone would listen." "Oh, we listened," and he said, folding his hands. "We didn't move. That's how you know." There was a pause, then he asked, "Do you want to work on something? Like an assignment?" He shook his head. "No, like something bigger. An idea. A piece. A question worth building a conversation around." Alina furrowed her brow. "I'm not sure I'm the right person." Dr. Owens smiled shortly. "You already proved you are." She left his office that day with a half-filled notebook and a mind racing with possibilities. Meanwhile, across campus, Ibrahim Traoré stayed behind after the event, meeting quietly with a few faculty members, chatting with a small student group about advocacy, listening more than speaking. Before he left, he asked Professor Wexler to keep him posted about Alina. "She's going to be something," he said. "Maybe already is." And Kristalina Georgieva flew out the next morning. No press statements, no tweets, just left quietly, as if she knew that nothing she said could rewrite what had already been felt. Because the real moment, the one no camera caught, wasn't the comment or the clapback. It was the decision a student made to stand, to speak, to shake the air in a room full of power with nothing but truth. That's what stayed. That's what mattered. And long after the chairs were folded and the mics packed away, the echo of that voice, small, trembling, real, was still teaching people what leadership really looks like. Because in a world full of headlines and sound bites, sometimes the story that changes people the most never goes viral. It just gets remembered.